I would like to talk about the problem with leaderless movements. And the basic idea here is that leaderless movements can be hijacked by other causes. They can be discredited by people coming in and participating and sort of shifting the meaning of that movement toward their own causes. And that's just really hard to control with a leaderless movement where there isn't either a person or group in charge at the top and setting boundaries around what that movement means and what belongs inside the movement and what does not belong inside the movement. And so a lot of leaderless movements, I think, have amazing causes that they're fighting for, but those causes can peter out or become manipulated, or there's a lot of things that can happen. And this is me sort of exploring what is the life cycle of a leaderless movement, what are the philosophical reasons these can be hijacked, and what's the hope? How can leaderless movements actually lead to positive change? And in what situations will they lead to positive change? And ultimately, this is actually going to be an argument for institutions, that movements should develop institutions, essentially, that create some kind of group of leaders. I think that's the argument that I talked myself into by the end of analyzing this. So here we go. All right, I'm going to explain the life cycle of leaderless movements, but first I would like to give you an example, and I would also like you to come up with your own examples. And specifically, I would like you to think of one positive example of something that you think was a really good movement that perhaps didn't get as much traction as you were hoping, or that perhaps took a left turn at some point along the way that you thought was not the best for the movement. So that's one example I would like you to come up with. And the other is a movement of something that you disagreed with, or a group or thing that happened that you were like, this movement is really destructive, could be dangerous, and I really hope this doesn't take off. And maybe you were starting to worry about that. So I think this content is going to work best if you think of both examples, a movement you supported, a movement you opposed. Now I'm going to give an example just so you can have one in your head and so I can talk about it. And that will just be, let's say 15 years from now, there is a Take Back Our Libraries movement, where the libraries have a whole bunch of rules for kicking people out of libraries, and those rules are sort of unjust. They tend to kick out poor people who need access to the resources in the libraries, and there's going to be a movement to change that so that libraries have broader access, especially to the people who need them. So this is going to be an example of a good movement, but I do want to emphasize that it goes both ways. All right, so here we have this life cycle of the leaderless movement. And early in the stages, before this movement has taken off, I think this oftentimes starts in a small group of people. And this group of people can be very principled, they can be philosophical, these can be people who really have a heartbeat on a problem that is deep and profound and that society is not investing enough resources in. Or it can be a small group of people, perhaps if we're thinking about the bad movement, who have some sort of resentment, some kind of axe to grind, and they have a philosophy about what is causing the problems they experience in their life, which they're projecting onto some political issue. Those are sort of two things that can be true of the small initial group. Now, the second thing, the thing that leads to the viral spread of this movement tends to be some kind of viral online content. And I think there's going to be a few characteristics of this content. One is that it sort of captures people's emotions in a way that they understand personally. Like it taps into an experience that they know that caused them shame or frustration, or where they genuinely experienced injustice in their life. And it sort of allows them to project those personalized emotions onto the situation, which can be good if that's causing them to empathize with people that they really should be empathizing with. Or it can be bad if it is sort of taking personalized experiences and taking advantage by projecting personalized experiences onto a cause that is only loosely connected. So I think these viral experiences, oftentimes this might be footage of something, this might be this might be an election of someone that this group didn't agree with. This could be an interaction or an exchange online that is just representative of negative interactions that people who follow the movement have in their lives. So it's something like this. It sort of catches fire and riles up the population in a way that's sort of spreading. It creates unity. This can be a very hopeful stage in this process where you see this injustice and you connect with the injustice. There's lots of other people who are starting to connect with this injustice that you care a lot about, and people have hope that real change could happen. And then what happens at the top here, I didn't know exactly how to represent this, but there's sort of a bit of an unraveling, and I would like to talk more about how this happens in a second. But first of all, I want to say that even though I do think there's some unraveling and some hijacking of the movements that can happen up here, and oftentimes that does lead to the decline in a movement that had potential to do good in the world. I think that's a phenomenon we see. I do think there will be some lasting effects, which I will talk about at the end of the video. Now, this is going to be happening at the top of that peak we just saw. This is basically the moment of unraveling. And there's two types of people that can unravel a movement, that can come in. And the first is people who are for something else. I'm going to call this the purple party. So maybe this is a small political party with certain beliefs. They have a whole set of beliefs, and they're going to come in and intentionally hijack the movements in some cases. So this box is where we have intentional actors hijacking the movement for their own cause. Now, how might this happen in the example that I just gave about the Take Back Our Libraries movement? Let's say the Purple Party has a long list of things they believe in, and one of those is that there should be strong credentials for anyone in public service. Now, the Purple Party in the world I'm creating is mainly focused on teachers. They think teachers need to have this long list of requirements, they need background checks, they need all of this kind of stuff. But they can take that same logic and say, actually, we think this long list of requirements and background checks should be applied to librarians. And they can make this case that if the librarians were chosen according to the Purple Party's criteria, then this injustice in the library with people getting unjustly kicked out would not have happened. So it's a little bit of a loose story, but it's a plausible story, especially if people are riled up and they feel the injustice. And, oh, by the way, during the growth of the movement phase, one characteristic there is it's all about movement for awareness of the problem. It's not about actual on-the-ground solutions to the problem. It's just people getting riled up about the problem. So when the Purple Party comes in and tries to hijack that emotion, that political force for their causes, if they can present some kind of solution that is loosely tied in with the problem people are upset about, that can be one way for them to hijack the movement for their own purposes. Now, there's going to be another type of intentional derailing of the movement, which is people who are against the movement to begin with. So with the library example, this might be people who want fairly strict criteria against harassment, against, bad smelling people in the library who will keep people out there, people who actually don't like the likely outcome of the movement are going to be against the movement, and these people may intentionally discredit the movement. And this tends to happen by picking out examples of people who join the movement who are not unsavory characters, people who are bullies, who are violent, who are shaming of others, who use people and are generally unjust people in the world. If you can find some examples of those people who happen to join the movement and sort of highlight that, oh, this is what the movement brings, this is what's attached to the movement, then that's one way of discrediting the whole movement. And actually, another way of discrediting the movement would actually be to point out these hijackers. So if you can look at the movement and say, oh wait, the Purple Party, you know that crazy Purple Party with their long list of weird ideas, they're actually in charge of this movement. They're the ones making decisions. You can probably find evidence for that. And that's actually another way of discrediting the movement. Now, I want to say one more thing about this. Like, what does this have to do with the leaderless nature of the movement? Well, part of the job of a leader, and by the way, when I say leader, I mean either a group of people or a single person, either of those. The leader's job is to keep in the good and keep out the bad. It's to maintain the boundaries. And a good leader is going to recognize people trying to hijack the movement and keep them out. And it's going to recognize people trying to discredit, or it's going to recognize the bad actors that the discreditors are pointing to, and it's going to say, no, that's not part of our movement. As a matter of fact, to be part of our movement, you have to sort of meet certain criteria. And of course that becomes bureaucratic. It adds these weird layers to it, but the boundaries can keep this stuff out. Leaderless movements do not have a mechanism for keeping this stuff out, so things do tend to unravel. Now, I would also like to point out that you don't need these intentional actors for a leaderless movement to be derailed. So, for example, it could be that, let's say, instead of the whole Purple Party, there is just a well-meaning group of people who happen to be really gung-ho about credentialing public employees, teachers and firefighters and librarians. In which case, this group of people may feel a tug in their heart in that moment when the movement is growing, and they may say, actually, I've been arguing all along for more stringent background checks on librarians. I'm a natural ally for this cause. As a matter of fact, there's no difference between me and this cause. And so they may take up the mantle of, rectifying that injustice by melding it with their own cause in their head. Now, of course, the way they approach this cause is very specific to their past experiences, but they're not intentionally hijacking the movement for their own purposes in a nefarious way. They really do believe that their approaches are the solution, but that same group can unintentionally hijack the cause. If you're promoting background checks among librarians as the key way of addressing this, is that consistent with the movement? Maybe, kind of, but it could also derail the movement if people see injustices in this particular approach. I'm going to call that one believers in parallel causes. They're honest believers, they just happen to be doing the same thing that the hijackers are doing. Now, what about people who are maybe not even intentionally against the movement? As a matter of fact, maybe these are people who were for the movement to begin with, but they start to notice things around the edges of the movement that they disagree with, negative consequences, or maybe they're actually even sort of in the inner circle in the movement, and they start to see the natural politics that happen when you take a cause that people collectively care about and try to deal with actual real-world solutions, and you find that these solutions are hard to contend with. There's upsides and downsides. There may not be a perfect solution that you're sure will work. There's all kinds of politics that go on within the inner circle. So this could actually be people who get disillusioned by the way the movement is playing out. And once again, these two groups, the reason for this ugly stuff is actually very similar for the reason for this. It's that without a leader, you don't have these good boundaries around the movement, so it's easy for people to get disillusioned even if they're part of the movement when it's rising. And it's easy for people to sort of meld their own causes with the causes of the movement in their heads. And even if that's not good for the movement, there's no leader to say, hey, wait a second, we need to create a clear distinction between this and this.